thank you very much, and thank you all for coming on a Friday evening when you could have bussed out of town and gone to someplace even prettier than Princeton, but I don't know where that would be. I'm really happy to be here and talk with you, because this is work in progress that I'm engaging here tonight. I'm trying to make a new project on Japan and food that would help us rethink ideas about work. You know, everybody talks about the Japanese work ethic and stuff like that. Well, those things kind of went under the wire, under the radar with the end of the trade war, but we want to talk about work in a more experiential way, in a way that really tells what's happening when you work in your mind, in your hand, and in the product. So I'm going to use coffee as one of my favorite substances, second to single malt scotch, and talk about what makes coffee work in Japan. I am really interested in principles and practice, but I'm actually much more interested in what goes on in the moment. You know, this is anthropology at work. We're not usually flying up here as much as we are down here at the bar. So as a preliminary kind of broad idea, I'm bringing in, and this is work in progress, I'm just beginning to look at, well, I guess the three main kinds of food work in Japan would be domestic, artisanal, and industrial, but there are many other kinds of food work. But broadly speaking, I would suggest that food work in Japan is something that gives value to the food, to the consumer, and to the maker of the food. If there's any principles at all, which I will not heavily dwell upon, they lie in the values of adaptivity rather than orthodoxy, creativity rather than scripted or spiritual qualities, rather than this much touted work ethic. So none of the orthodoxy or spirituality that are commonly associated with Japanese crafts appear to me to be what really motivates the people who make the food you eat. Well, let's go to Peter's question. Why coffee? Why am I here to talk about coffee? And yes, why not green tea? And this is one of my favorite reasons for writing the book in the first place. Coffee is the #1 most consumed, publicly consumed beverage in Japan. Japan is third in imports of coffee beans in the world. America's first. You know who's second? Germany. Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting. The German importation of coffee beans is only partly for local consumption in Germany. It's actually more for processing and making into coffee products that are then exported. So syrups and powders and all that stuff. And that accounts for it. Of course, Germany is a heavy coffee drinking country, but it accounts for its position in the world. But coffee has become as Japanese as tempura and sushi, and I'm going to complicate that later. So for our purposes, coffee is a really good exemplar of the practices that I want to examine. And it is also a non-native substance. Coffee doesn't grow in Japan. They tried in Okinawa for a while, but it doesn't work as well as Brazil. It shares places with foods that have also become assimilated in Japan. And like many other foods in Japan, it has its ordinary, unexceptional side and its profile of high connoisseurship as well. So drawing from both coffee and foodways, I want to look at how, what we can learn from these coffee makers who use techniques that follow their ingredients rather than come down from, as I said before, some kind of scriptural way of doing things. And also are guided by available technologies. People should be aware that technique comes out of technology. The available technologies govern how you will use them. We ate differently before we had knives and forks and spoons, right? And so in Japan, the early ways of making coffee produced a different kind of brew than what you would have now with the much more finely tuned pouring spouts, for example. Not what you thought. It's not machines. So I like to think about tools, techniques, and their use, and the way people feel about their work. So back to me just a little bit. I don't want to give you too much more autobiography because you've had quite enough already. I am a food anthropologist, and it's a really great field. Almost everything you eat can be tax deductible. I'm also a Japan anthropologist, and that came first for a while, only a while, masking the fact that I was eating and constantly taking notes about food. But when I was a graduate student, if you wrote about food or demonstrated an interest in cooking, you had little academic legitimacy. So I happily studied all kinds of things about Japan, schools, families, teenagers, material culture, sex, Sex was actually more legitimate than food. When I prepared to enter graduate school, I earned a scant living cooking as a caterer, and this is where the story, a word from our sponsor, comes in. And the Center for West European Studies was full of very experienced connoisseur eaters who knew what they were eating, especially if the food came from Western Europe. So I avoided, as a caterer, cooking them anything that they could compare to in its better form. And I did publish 2 cookbooks back then by a piece of publishing luck that nearly sunk my academic career. When I got to graduate school, my advisors said, take all of that food off your resume or you'll never get a job in academics. I did that and devoted myself to things above the neck until I got tenure. And then I came out of the cooking closet and I teach food anthropology. So just to say, about 2 years ago, Peter Doherty, in the front row here, called me out of the blue for me, and asked if Princeton could republish this cookbook, which was a stunning moment. And it's out again in a 40th anniversary edition, and as Peter said, studded with cartoons by Ed Koren. That's why you want the book, it's the cartoons. I'm very grateful for this moment, and it has allowed me to revel in food on many dimensions. You can ask me later if you're interested in the thing that got me through catering, because I was completely inexperienced, was my special Julia Child rescue service, which was always available. But that you'll have to ask me about. Let's go back to Japan. My first trip to Japan was in 1963. It didn't expose me to the high end of Japanese food. I couldn't afford it, although at the time the dollar brought in 360 yen. It was good days. But I could do pretty well. And I learned the basics of food, which was the right way to begin, and I ate everything. An aside on, I think, on Japanese food as it has come down to us today. Some of you probably were in Japan over those early years when people didn't know much about it. And what is known outside of Japan now about food greatly exceeds what I knew then. There's a very nice ethnography of a fish market in Tokyo called Tsukiji, the fish market at the center of the world, by a colleague of mine, Ted Bester. And he says that America has now undergone sushiization, the transportation and transmutation of this food from Japan to places where it had never been seen. In the late 1970s and 80s, there were hordes of American businessmen traveling to Japan to learn the management secrets of Japan's success. They were taken out to the best restaurants. They were treated really well by their Japanese colleagues, and they were constantly being treated to sushi. So now, sushi in Japan wasn't, nor is it now, an everyday food. It's a special food. The visitors couldn't realize that because they were treated to it every day. So sushi did arrive in America as a specialty food first, but somewhat rarefied and exotic in the 70s. But now it has become every day. Even supermarkets in my home state of Minnesota have sushi stations with plastic-wrapped trays of inside-out maki and possibly vaguely Asian-appearing preparers behind the counter. As one supermarket manager told me, they have to have black hair. We are told, of course, that the world has become McDonaldized. The opposite then, this food has been assimilated in Japan to the degree that it is seen as Japanese. There is no need to call it American. It is McDonald's or bigumaku. Well, there's a good little story about a little Japanese boy whose parents were taking him on his first trip to America, to Hawaii. And he said, no, he was 6 years old or something. They won't have any Japanese food. I can't go. I won't eat anything. And they said, don't worry. They have Japanese food. So he's kicking and screaming all the way to Honolulu. They get out of the plane. They're driving into Waikiki, and they see the Golden Arches. And he says, it's okay. They have Japanese food here. So this question of assimilation and identity in food is a very interesting one. Now, I want to say something else about the sushiization of America before we go on to talk about coffee. It's a really interesting reversal of status. As I said before, it's a high-end food in Japan. You pay a lot of money for good sushi. You pay a lot of good money for good sushi in New York, too. But the reversal of status, this high-end food becomes available to everybody in the supermarket in America. And to look at something on the opposite side is ramen. How many of you have had an exquisite gourmet bowl of ramen? I don't mean instant ramen. I don't mean the thing that got you through graduate school. Yeah, okay, so you know what I'm talking about. That's where ramen has gone in this country. Ramen in Japan is the lowest food, under the tracks in a stall food. What you have when you're recovering from a hangover or about to have one. So this becomes a high-end quarry for chow hounds in America, and ramen transported seems to have switched positions as sushi did. I'm going to leave out questions of, the dire word of authenticity here, because my students are always asking, where can I get authentic sushi? Where can I get, and I say something, well, I live in Boston. There's not what it is in New York. But we talk about authenticity, and it seems like what we care about as anthropologists is the quest itself. To whom does authenticity matter, and why? There isn't a orthodoxy about what is authentic. The best you can do is say, well, for me, authentic is what my grandmother made. That's as close as you can come. But if the point of origin of a food counts, then I have to issue a spoiler. Sushi doesn't come from Japan. It's from Southeast Asia. It came to Japan. Nor does tempura come from Japan. It's Portuguese. It came in the 1500s with the missionaries and later the traders. Or any deep-fried thing like tonkatsu, the fried cutlet thing. So you're looking at where to draw the lines of acceptability or identity in a foodstuff. It's possible to say, and this is a sort of segue to what I want to talk about, that one thing that you could call authentic or acceptably culturally identified is technique in foodways. So if I talk about knife work, if I talk about the ways in which tools are used, then you're coming close to something people would recognize as a culturally determined right way. But it's not the dish, it's not the menu even, or even the ingredients per se that are taken or tested for authenticity within Japan. There is, however, something interesting happening now in Japan, which is an interest in locavoreism. And this gets to this idea of regional goods, regionally grown goods. It's a small country. The distribution system is great. You don't need to travel far for something good, and the food can travel to you very easily. But now because of Western ideas about locavoreism as a kind of trendy topic, you have marketed nationally in Japan kyo-yasai, which is Kyoto-grown vegetables, or other regionally terroir-ish foodstuffs. The irony, of course, is that you can have them shipped to you. You don't have to go to Kyoto to get them. But they're prized and marketed for tourism as things that people want to bring home. You know, I've been to Kyoto and I got the vegetables. That's kind of the line. Terroir as such is not as significant in Japan for connoisseurs as are technique and taste. The ism of locavoreism then was a borrowed idea, the ideology of it. Well, let's skip on a bit because I want to talk much more about craft and technique. Traditional apprenticeships in crafts, such as pottery or carpentry work, emphasized something called the well-practiced hand. And they expect a high degree of effort and discipline and time on task and stick-to-itiveness, perseverance, the word is gaman. I was enrolled for a year of my youth in a professional cooking school in Japan. And it's probably the hardest thing I ever did. I was stymied by the lack of verbal direction. I should have known that I wouldn't have to test my Japanese language skills. It was all observation. I began by cleaning, which is the usual way one begins in a craft or that kind of study. Cleaning and cleaning. After a couple of weeks, I was allowed to cut a carrot. Now, I was so thrilled. You know, it's like holding out on your kid until he absolutely wants to do something, and then you let him, and wow, you know, it was just like that. And I cut carrots, and I cut carrots, and I cut carrots, and it was another 3 weeks or so until I got it right. But I was never told that I was doing something wrong. I just had to keep kind of guessing at what the teacher wanted. I don't know when that happened, actually. So apparently it did. Apparently I had learned to trust my hand, that practiced hand, and not my head, which kept asking why, how, you know. So I was then allowed to clean the knife, which is a big step forward. But I was never allowed to sharpen it. That's for the master. So there's a lot of this kind of patience, perseverance. You're not being tested, though, for your perseverance. You're being tested to get it right, to make the right carrot. That's all it is. The case has been made that the knife is of the essence. When swords and their fine craftsmanship were no longer needed as demonstrations of prowess and connoisseurship, many swordsmiths became knife makers. I get my knives at a little place in Kyoto, which during the Onin Wars, which 1400s, were making swords. The sword maker's craft has been translated into knifemanship, and the older techniques of making knives have given way to new forms of lamination, of layering of metals, of bonding. They constantly are seeking to improve. You're not sticking to an old way for the old way's sake. you're doing something new because it makes the product better. It makes your practice better. It changes your practice. The fact that knives have improved so much allows for the practice, the technique to change. It allows for those finely cut little decorative things on your kaiseki meal. You couldn't have made those with the old knives. So the standards or the aesthetics have changed because the knives changed, and so did the work. Now, we're told that Japanese food is a principled cuisine. That gets in my way a little. I'm not big on listing principles, but interestingly enough, the very famous chef, whose name you might know, Nobuyuki Matsuhisa, says for him, it's all about technique. That Japanese techniques have allowed him to make Japanese food with any ingredients anywhere in the world. So he can go to Italy and not have any tofu and, make Japanese food because of his technique. There is some essentialization, however, of certain kinds of Japanese foods, the foods themselves. The traditional tripod of a Japanese meal, it usually ends with miso soup, rice, and pickles, the three things that show you the meal is about to end. Without rice, there's no meal. Without its pickles, no balance. And without the miso soup, no comfort. And that's really important. I think Nobu himself would allow that to be emblematic soul food. But his point is that neither ingredients, nor menus, nor dishes do not make his cuisine culturally Japanese. Well, conjecture about the relationship, if you want to, between technique and culinary identity in other cultures, other cuisines. Do the French care as much about their technique, or do they care more about ingredients? I mean, these are interesting questions. We don't want to stray into the realm, I don't want to stray into the realm of national character, what they call Nihonjin Ron, or the national, a theory of Japanese uniqueness. There's a lot of language out there. In a Wall Street Journal article last week, actually it was at the end of September, a Japanese chef in Brittany, in France, is lauded as reflecting, quote, Zen aesthetics and a cult of technical exactitude. The word cult springs out at you, as does the word Zen. The article goes on to add other elements of the common mantra about Japan, an insistence on the highest quality ingredients, reverence for nature. These are all seen to be Japanese elements. And indeed, these principles are extolled by Japanese themselves, of course. This is a lot of burden to place on the cook in the kitchen. Now, you may know that UNESCO has declared Japanese cuisine, washoku, as a World Heritage Cuisine. It is now a go-to cuisine. But in doing so, they had to decide what was Japanese food. So they chose kaiseki, which is a very special meal served before the tea ceremony. It's a very interesting, kind of complex set of values rather than actual foods. There is no one kaiseki menu. There are no foodstuffs that are labeled kaiseki. But kaiseki it was to become Japan's national cuisine and win this award. If UNESCO were actually to celebrate what is Japanese about washoku, it would have to, according to Nobu, canonize technique and maybe attitude, artisanality. Well, I'm going to end with this part of the discussion with the discussion of a word that keeps coming up now in Japan about the best food and the best coffee. And that is this word kodawari, kodawari. It's the moment of truth in the making of something where you have a definite focus. Did anybody see Jiro Dreams of Sushi? A few people did. Well, Jiro kind of embodies this idea of kodawari, this diligent, wholehearted pursuit of the best you can do. Shops advertise, here you can get kodawari coffee, or here you can get kodawari foodstuffs. It isn't only about food, though. Your diligence can be applied to any activity. I want to mention a book by a friend of mine, Heather Paxson, who wrote a wonderful book on artisanal cheese making in America. There is a crossover here. It's a nice book. And she describes the diligence and engagement of cheesemakers as they are transformed by their work. They become something else through making this fabulous cheese. They are given new, what she calls moral characters. Kodawari can do that to a person, whether you're making cheese or coffee. Well, coffee. I finally will get you to coffee. That business about whether coffee is Japanese or not. Coffee was brought to Japan, along with those ideas about tempura and tonkatsu, by Portuguese in the earliest arrival in the 16th century, and then by Dutch traders in the 17th century at the port of Nagasaki. By 1700, it was seen as a valuable commodity, so valuable that it could be presented as a Shinto shrine offering at a shrine in Kyushu called Dazaifu. It brought with it technologies that were used by the Dutch, French, and Germans of those days, governing the techniques that some of which have come down to us today. I'll show you some slides. But just as knife making changed cooking techniques and even the aesthetics of a dish, so did coffee making technique evolve from its boiled or dripped from a bag arrival in 1740 in a siphon coffee maker. You've seen siphon coffee makers that look like a laboratory? Yeah. They used to be popular here. Or now, the techniques, as with knives, develop and change with what's available. Now, there's some cultural priorities about what's chosen in the technologies, too. This is really interesting. The use of technologies is governed by an idea of, for example, efficiency, just to take one word that is used by coffee makers. But efficiency has different meanings. An American wanting a quick cup of joe defines efficiency as speedy. But this is less highly valued by the craft coffee maker, and some in New York as well, who sees efficiency in the spare and dedicated movements necessary in her view to make the best cup of coffee. These movements may be seen as annoying by the impatient American, but you should taste the coffee. Now, back to the story. Brazil was the first initiator of Japan's coffee history, besides all those early imports, but the big influence came from Brazil. In the late 19th century, coffee plantations in Brazil were looking for good farmers and sent to Japan for farmers. And Japanese farmers helped to grow the crops and Brazil's coffee industry. At the time, Brazil targeted Japan, this is kind of interesting, as its prime foreign market for coffee consumption. And at the turn of the century, sent 18 tons a year of beans to Japan to stimulate the taste for it. They created the market for their own product. The early coffee scene, well, that's the space of the modern urbanite's desire, but it came to Japan as a scene actually from London and New York. Not from Brazil, though Brazilian coffee ways were also of interest. There was one young man who, sent to Yale University by his dad in Japan in 1870, I didn't write down the date. In any case, he loved being in America because of New York's coffee houses. So he left New Haven as often as possible and spent most of his time in coffee houses in the big city and flunked out. So he went home to Japan in ignominy, but with the promise to do better, and he went to London on the way home. He took a very long route home, and in London he was further inspired by the coffee houses to create his own, which is called, in Japan it was called kahi chakan, which actually has the character for tea in it, as kisaten does now, which is another word for coffee house. In 1888, in Tokyo, he established his coffee house. He was a master of ambience and service and provided amazing amenities. I mean, big leather stuffed chairs. It looked like a London club. It had newspapers on racks. It had billiards. It had restrooms. It had secretary writing tables. It had everything. You could stay all day for about 1 sen, which is a micro unit of a yen, which was the cost of like 1 cup of coffee. He went broke because he provided all these amenities and he was incredibly popular. So it didn't work out for him because he was himself more of a customer than a manager. However, his story goes on, sadly. I won't give you the whole story. Read about it if you want the book. And it ends strangely in Seattle, where he died, where he started a small merchant coffee dry goods merchandise shop. But that failed too. He was sort of a sad luck case. But coffee went on without him. The social energy of these coffee spaces grew, and so did coffee connoisseurship. Mastery in coffee is really interesting. There are 3 people I want to talk about as sort of emblematic coffee masters, talk about what they do. They all in some ways set new standards for persnickety behavior, but they're all about the coffee. The first one I want to talk about is a man named Sekiguchi Aikido. I think he is still with us. He's probably 100 years old if he is. And he has manned this coffee house in Tokyo, in Shimbashi, for maybe 70 years, 60 years. Anyway, since the war, just barely. He has a firm grasp of what a good cup of coffee is. It's his way or the highway. And that coffee is so meticulous that it's actually kind of frightening to sit there because you think your hands are going to be slapped if you make the wrong move yourself. One good thing to do if you are a regular customer is to call 25 hours ahead of the time you will be coming for your cup of coffee. 25 hours, okay? Because he's going to then, and you order the bean of choice. He also values old beans. Green beans can keep for quite a while. Roasted beans cannot, 10 days max. This is a problem of knowing too much about coffee. But he will roast for you a Yemen 93, say, and you can order it as if you were ordering wine. And then you say you will be in at 3 p.m. the next day. Okay, fine. You get there, he makes the coffee for you in that meticulous pour-over way, which some of you may have witnessed in fine cafes. It takes a long time to get your cup of coffee, but you have to appreciate every moment of it. And he has perfected the water kettle spout, not the kettle you boil the water in, but the kettle you pour from, so that the long spout has a pinched ending. He calls it the crane's beak. And it's so narrow that only the tiniest driblets of water can pour through onto the coffee grounds in the filter holder, which he sometimes uses a nail bag, a flannel nail bag on a wire, over another pot which will become your cup of coffee. All right, if you come in and you don't know the rules, he will, and you say, got any milk? Sugar? He'll say, get out. And he'll say, look, I would have given you those things if you had told me when you said to roast your coffee yesterday that you would be having milk and sugar in your coffee. But you didn't say that. I would have roasted it differently for the milk and sugar. So he's something, his method to some people, one journalist calls it, he's doing the tea ceremony. He says, I hate the tea ceremony. It's all ritual. It's all formula. But, this is a matter of perception and self-presentation. Well, he's one kind of guy. Another master, and you say master for the bar person. Barista, only if you're going to Starbucks. A master, this one is a woman that I want to talk about, Sachan. And she's at a very interesting cafe in Kyoto, on a small upstairs cafe in a creaky wooden building whose halls house small studios and her bicycle repair shop cafe. It's up near Demachi-Yanagi, if anybody knows Kyoto. Sachan makes meticulous coffee. She's a hand-pour artisan. Handpoor is the coffee of choice for most of these people. She has learned her trade through a line of masters, which, if not explicitly the Iemoto-style, craftsman-style hierarchy, at least it acts as sources of authority for technique and even for service. Now, the counter's next to a bike repair area, and they're cheerful, kind of greasy ponytail guys wearing watch caps who are working on the bikes. So it's got a kind of ambience very different from Sekiguchi's ambience. Sachan takes a customer's order, chosen from a list of available beans, and they are by origin. She does do single origin. I should add one thing about that. Here we have learned through various chain coffee shops that single origin is a good thing. However, in Japan, a real master is judged by his blends, because he mixes beans to be able to bring out the best in each bean and to achieve balance and harmony and all those other good things. So don't eschew the blend in Japan if you're in a good coffee shop. The water is boiled and cooled a bit. You don't put boiling water on coffee ever. I've imbibed all of this literally and figuratively, so I'm terribly spoiled. The pour jug is warmed. The Nell bag, the flannel bag, is set over a glass pot and the ground's added, and they're ground only at that moment. The spiraled pouring in and pouring out is happening. Sachan makes no conversation. She is a pure, dedicated worker. And when a new customer comes in, she will not even lift her head and yell, "Irashai." She will not yell welcome, which is customary. And it's almost jarring that she doesn't do that. But her single-minded focus on the pouring is about service to the person she is about to serve. She's focused on that one customer. So this, somebody said to me, well, that's because she's a woman, she's so focused on service. I said, no, this is about non-gendered role-playing here. It's about the blending of service and artisanality that I would like to consider in my future work. The third guy is a completely different sort of person. His name is Tanaka, and he actually worked in New York for a long time. I think he was with Counterculture Coffee for a while, but he is a pretty well-known guy. He's the owner, he's returned to Japan, he's the owner of Bear Pond Coffee in Shimokitazawa, if you know Tokyo. It's a kind of funky, hipsterish neighborhood full of small corners and shabbier-than-thou storefronts. The master Tanaka, though, he greets you, he takes your order, and he begins to work. It's early in the day, and it better be if you want an espresso shot. I'll tell you why. He has a Marzocco, which is one of the good Italian espresso machines. And it's high up on the counter, and Tanaka begins the grinding and weighing and tamping procedure and draws your shot with a fine-tuned, practiced hand. It will be, no doubt, the best you've ever had. Very syrupy with a crema on it that you just won't believe. It's like eating caramel custard almost. And when you've finished, you're admiring him because, I can talk more about the source of his beans, but I would like to go to what happens. He gives you a lot of information about where the beans came from. And like a lot of these very fine-tuned coffee makers, he gets his beans not from a big organization, not from UCC or something like that, which is a big coffee company, but from his personal friend down the street who roasts the beans just for him to his specs. Now, you've got a friend with you. You've come into Bear Pond with somebody else. And he wants the same thing. He wants your espresso. Next to the Marzocco are an array of tools, small screwdrivers, tiny wrenches, brushes, and Tanaka carefully disassembles the group head and portafilter the working parts on your espresso maker, which he has also customized to suit his purpose. He takes off the steel plate with a screwdriver. He steam cleans everything. The screw threads are a bit off, so he taps them into place. He reassembles the whole thing and then begins to make a shot of espresso for your friend. So maybe 25 minutes after it's ordered, he's ready to draw that next shot. One hopes that your friend that you've come with is respectful of this process. But Tanaka is interesting. He says that he has made the espresso machine less of a machine and more of an extension of his hand. He does not, like many Japanese old school coffee makers, believe in a machine intervening between your hand and the making of the coffee. You want to make it less machine. So it's very exhausting to be Tanaka. He can make maybe 20 shots a day. And then he says, espresso finished. And then you get a pour over. He can do that, or his staff does. If you're very lucky and he's not tired, he makes you something else, which is his signature drink. It's called a dirty. This is 3 differently pulled shots, same coffee, but with different fine adjustments of the machine to make the shot taste different if you have a sandpapered tongue and can feel that. So it's nuances of flavor, but he layers them with milk. It's really interesting, in a mason jar, so that you can see the layers. You sip through the milk to the first one, to the next one. It's amazing. I don't know how it works. I realize I'm going on and on about the brew, but I think there's something else to say about coffee. Coffee serves many niches in the lives of people in Japan. It is not only the high-end connoisseur brew. There's a lot of chain stores. There's a lot of Starbucks. They have a sort of diminishing word for Starbucks, but we won't go into that. They believe that Starbucks burns its beans and to hide defects. So, well, one of the things about the functions the cafe serves, though, is that there are multiple. There are multiple reasons to be in a cafe. Not very many people get takeout. And takeout is not usually offered. That's why you go to Starbucks if you really must. So the ways in which you use the cafe can be multiple. And part of the fun of writing the book was to sit in cafes in Japan for about 4 years and talk to people about what they were doing there, which was quite a lot of fun. The master is responsible for creating the spaces in which the kinds of experiences people value can be had. So these are social uses, they're personal uses, rarely laptop uses. There's often no Wi-Fi anyway. Starbucks offers Wi-Fi, so you've got somewhere to go. But the people told me, you know, coffee provides me with time out in a life that's very busy, a space out in a life that's very physically crowded, and a chance to be private in public. I like that phrase. Private in public is a way of using that space. Doing something where you observe others, but you're not in their life. You're on your own. You're doing your thing by having a cup of coffee. Yes, there's other kinds of coffee. There's vending machine coffee, which is amazing. You get vending machines everywhere on every street, and their cheery light welcomes you late at night when you need a coffee, and they serve both hot and cold coffee in cans. Now, you don't walk down the street drinking this coffee, by the way. You stand near the vending machine and place the empty can in the special repository for such cans. So vending machine behavior is also kind of interesting. To end the talk and show you some slides, I just want to refer to one food moment, recent food moment, in which Japanese food talked to me. in a small town near Worcester, Massachusetts, about 3 weeks ago, a Japanese television network filmed one episode of a series they're doing, which was a competition between a Boston area sushi owner, an American sushi restaurant owner, and a Japanese sushi chef from Tokyo. Now, the show's going to be aired on New Year's Eve, and I've signed a sheet. Oh, by the way, New Year's Eve is the single most hallowed primetime television slot anywhere in the world. Japan, New Year's Eve television is a must. So, but I've signed something that says I cannot disclose the outcome of this event before New Year's, but I can tell you something of the experiences of this competition. I was a judge. I couldn't help but observe distinctions along what one might say American and Japanese lines, though I tried hard not to make that the parameter. It was a setup, though. There was a Japanese flag on one side where the Japanese chef was, and a Boston Red Sox poster on the other side. The first thing you noticed was the tables they were using, and the mise en place of the American chef, who's a very high-end, capable chef, was a table jammed with little pots and ingredients, and I mean, it was kind of dazzling in the variety of little colored pots and things. The Japanese table, empty, and except for 2 knives. So there I'm thinking, oh, this is a setup. I know what I'm supposed to think about this. And I did think that. The knife work I watched very carefully. We were allowed to stroll around. There was overhead cameras filming everything. The knife work was not rapid, but very conscious. I'm talking about the Japanese knife work. Very spare, clean, and precise. There were 2 knives, as I said, on his table, and about 6 knives on the American table. Interestingly, the Japanese chose to use fish bought at the Boston Fish Market, while the Americans sent to Tsukiji Market in Tokyo for his fish. Trying too hard. By the way, Japanese sushi good sushi requires fish that are not fresh, by the way, not to the American idea of fresh. We think it has to be right out of the water. We're kind of scared of raw fish. But a Japanese sushiya would like to sell fish at about 4 or 5 days out of the water, depending on the kind of fish. And it should also be at room temperature. It shouldn't be cold. Also, the rice should be warm. There's a lot of things to know. What I learned at this session was it is about the rice. It is all about the rice. You start with the rice, and then you add on to it what goes with rice. So the rice governs. We often see rice as the base, and you can put anything on top, like cream cheese and smoked salmon, a BLT maki. We put anything we want on the rice. And let me tell you about some of the dishes that were presented to us. The American sushi of the nigiri, the rice with things on it, was a very small oval of rice. This was one of the dishes. They presented a lot of different dishes, but this was supposed to be his star turn. A small oval of rice topped with chocolate nibs from a cacao pod, plus foie gras, truffle oil, chocolate drizzle, sauce, and capping it all, a large globule of blown squid ink. It was a narrow tower. It was also a taste bomb. You put the whole thing in your mouth at once, he said. So you get it all. It was super umami. It was super rich. And it was very, very complex. Another of his nigiri had hand-fried potato crisps on it, kind of like French fries. He engaged frequently and deftly the use of a butane torch. He loved torching things. Now, obviously, I'm not going to give anything away here because I'm not supposed to. The Japanese chef put fish on the rice. That's what he did. Sometimes a dab of wasabi, sometimes a citrus marinade brushed on. You could easily watch the construction because his table was bare. It was hard to watch the construction on the other gentleman's table. What I discerned, though, was each American-made piece of sushi, each nigiri or maki, was a concert of flavors in itself. It was a whole meal of flavors all together, whereas the Japanese sushi were presented together to be an assemblage of flavors in different parts, a low-lying landscape of simple things, where the tower of taste that the American created, it was fabulous tasting. I was not going to deny that. They both exhibited that word, that concept, kodawari, the diligence, the passion for making something good. The American as well as the Japanese. I'm not permitted to say who won, but after all, the title of the program was Japan Pride. So I'm entertaining questions from you because this has been a wide-ranging talk, and I'm sure you have thought of other things you'd like to know about. Fire away. Let's see. Dario is going to go around with the microphone, I think. Wait, should I do the slides first? Yes. I forgot all about that. How could I? All right. They're real quick. Okay. The title. That picture comes up later, and I'll describe it later. Okay, this week, something happened that was very strange. Somebody has drawn a cartoon version of my coffee book, and this was, it's the best citation anybody ever had. So I just wanted to show it to you. It's kind of funny. The cartoonist lives in Japan. The message. She also mentions some shops that offer tantalizingly unique coffee experiences worth seeking out, people who have a passion for making each cup perfect. She got it. She got it. When framed as a worthwhile educational pursuit, one's fixation on coffee can suddenly seem like noble dedication. So that's the takeaway. Now, I talked about technique governed by tools. This is a knife maker in Kyoto who has been working this knife. It was a knife being made for me. At that point, I was on a television show that was for the Discovery Channel on Japanese food. And I took the crew around to photograph all of these people. It took about 3 months to make this knife. So not necessarily fresh, not necessarily local. These tuna were from the North Atlantic, and that was at Tsukiji Market. Seasonal is best. These are himeji. We call them mullet. There are senses of seasonality, though locality isn't quite as important as seasonality. Oh, me de taberu means we eat with our eyes. So the aesthetics of food are terribly important, very interesting. This is a very casual presentation, but to us it looks very artful. Now, me de nomu, you drink with your eyes, is what I chose to say about coffee. This is at a very beautiful coffee shop on top of a hill in Kyoto called Mo-on. Maybe somebody knows Mo-on. And Mo-on has an exquisite aesthetic. Everything is sort of Bauhaus about it, and everything is very simple. So that is my version of eating with your eyes. This is Sachan, the woman I described to you who won't greet the customer interrupting her practice. Look at the poster behind her. Do you recognize it? Nobody? It's Fidel, golfing. Yeah, it's part of the counterculture. This is at Bear Pond after he had given up making espresso shots, and he gave me a pour-over. You're not allowed to take pictures in the shop, but I snuck a picture of my press pass. So I couldn't get him with all his tools at the counter. The machine, an extension of the hand. Now this is from 1740, when the siphon first came to Nagasaki with the Dutch traders. So you can see on the table, it's a little hard to see, but you can see, let's see if I can get a pointer working. There's the siphon. It looks very like the siphons that are today used in Japan. There's today's siphon. There are shops that are devoted to siphon only, and that's one of them. And it's a very old school kind of coffee, not particularly finicky. In fact, this is a place where bus drivers like to go. It's a working class shop. Japanese coffee style has traveled. You can certainly see it in New York at any of the Blue Bottle coffee shops or at High Collar, which is in the East Village. You see a lot of Japanese coffee making, even though it's not necessarily described as Japanese, but the methods have traveled. And in London, it's all over the place. Blue Bottle's headquarters in San Francisco offers you Kyoto cold brew. Now, James Freeman, the head of Blue Bottle, did not go to Kyoto to find out about a cold brew in Kyoto. He developed a cold brew and decided, because Japanese coffee names have such cachet, to call it Kyoto cold brew. But he does use this equipment that is made by the Hario Coffee Equipment Company in Japan and is used all over Japan. Oops, sorry. Well, that's that. Let's see. I knew you told me how to black it out, but we can leave it like that. Am I supposed to press that? Thanks, that's good. Right, probably you have more questions now. Yeah. We're going to wait for a microphone so everybody can hear you, especially me.
Thank you. In your introduction, you said your second favorite beverage was a single malt.
Sorry? Oh.
And I thought it interesting, in the lecture you said that some people thought single bean was preferable, but a blend. And I think some
Good
Scots
point.
would say a blended
Absolutely.
Scotch is...
You're right.
Okay.
We eschew blends because we think the singles are better. Absolutely right. There are some very, very important prize-winning scotches in Japan. Yamazaki makes the world, they won the world competition over Scottish scotches. So they do blends. It's a good question. Anybody else?
I wonder if water is as important a factor in Japan coffee making as it is, for instance, in Italy, where
The quality of the water.
are they very fussy about the water used?
Some definitely are. There's one cafe I go to in Kyoto where they use water only from a special kind of sacred spring. And that is got two things going for it. It's very good water. They do not believe that distilled water is good. They want water that has minerals in it. They want that they work with the minerals.
Like spring water?
Yeah, but it depends on the spring, right? So yes, they do care. And there are people up in Cambridge, where I come from, who test out the water and say, I'm not making you any coffee today, the water's off. So, it travels.
I also wanted to add that Paris has been as sushified as
Yes.
New York. It's unbelievable. There are 3 sushi shops or restaurants virtually on every street.
It's interesting, too, that sushi shops can be managed and run and cooked at by all manner of people. There's all this purism, this sort of essentialization that sushi has to be made by a Japanese person.
Mostly Chinese.
Yeah, well, in Boston, it's mostly Korean and Chinese in the sushi shops. I know Peter had his hand up.
So in the spirit
Oh,
of
okay.
Boston and New York, where do you like to have coffee in Boston and where do you like to have coffee in New York?
Ooh, challenge. Okay, there are now several really good places sometimes who I work with on coffee tour, you know, so I get them to come with me. Dwell Time in Cambridge is really, really, really good. And in New York, I go to Everyman. I go to Blue Bottle in Williamsburg. I go to 9th Street, Espresso. There's a lot. Grumpy, Abrazo. It's really hard to choose. There's a lot of good coffee in New York. I think we've got,
One more.
okay.
The visitor to Japan has the sense that in terms of coffee, all the rage is Italian-style espresso or cappuccinos or whatever. Is that a misimpression, or do the Japanese think, as they have done with other things, that they've taken the foreigner's precious good and made it better in their own way? Or is the best for them what is supposedly, quote, authentic Italian?
Okay, authenticity is in the eye of the beholder, right? So yes, they definitely appreciate. By the way, Italy is a main destination for food tourism from Japan. I've written about this, but never mind. And coffee. But it's seen as, okay, we're in Italy, we're going to drink Italian coffee, but left to our own devices, we want this kind of coffee. So there's both things going on. Sure. There's not a singular view. There's a very tolerant, adaptive view. Yeah. Did you have a...
I just was, and you might mention something about this, I was just stunned that there are coffee masters who select the beans bean by bean.
Is your coffee master calling?
But which is a little bit like the way they make sake, where they literally polish the rice. And select
Sure.
the beans.
Yeah.
Not
No,
an economical way to operate.
No, none of this is. But it's of course, let me say that the price of a fine cup of coffee in Tokyo can go up to $20. So, all right, leave that aside. But you're right, there are certain carryovers, and I'm going to investigate sake brewing for that reason, because there's that selectivity, those high standards for the right way of doing something. There is a woman who has recently come through who is called Madame Koji, because her company has been in the family for 17 generations, making the sake, using the sake lees for fermentation of other products like pickles. So she has this fine-tuned feeling about her product in the same way that the coffee people sort bean by bean. Yeah.
I think we probably have to move on, but thank you very much.